inform us about the difficult position of Connecticut when it comes to electricity prices and supply. Senator Fazio was elected state senator in August 2021, and he was re-elected in 2022. He represents Connecticut's 36th district, which includes Greenwich, Stamford, and New Canaan. He grew up in Greenwich and attended public schools here. After studying economics at Northwestern University, he chose to return to Connecticut to live and work. Ryan is the ranking senator on the legislature's Energy and Technology Committee and Planning and Development Committee as well. He also serves on the Transportation Committee and the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. Let's welcome Senator Ryan Fazio.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back. It's always one of the coolest things to speak to the RMA. When you see the roster of speakers, I'm always surprised that I can manage to get the invitation. But it's a great pleasure, and I'm also excited to talk about one of the topics that I find the most interesting, but also the topic that keeps me up the most at night as the ranking member on the Energy Committee. Not just how can we ensure that there's an affordable energy portfolio in Connecticut, how can we ensure that we're protecting our environment, but also how can we ensure that 10 to 20 years from now we're going to be able to keep the lights on. We take a lot for granted in civilization, but the precarious forecast for this energy portfolio, for the energy grid here in the Northeast, really brings some of those things into question. The opening slide kind of summarizes what our concerns are. It's reliability, cost, and environmental considerations. And the picture is just from a couple weeks ago of me in front of the Millstone Power Plant, which provides about 40% of all the electricity generated in Connecticut. It's zero carbon, it's reliable, it's around what the average cost of generating electricity is in the state as well. So it's an important asset, probably the most important asset we have in Connecticut. So before I start speaking, let's see what the experts are saying about our reliability concerns. Billy Joel, he said he's seen the lights go out on Greenwich Avenue. That's a bit disconcerting. Reba McEntire, that's the night that the lights went out on Connecticut. Oh, another rather dire forecast. And Journey, when the lights go down in the city that works, which is Stamford. Well, these are rather dire prognoses, but hopefully we can come up with a more positive one in the end. So where is our power grid now? In Connecticut, you know this every month, unfortunately, when you pay your bill to Eversource, that Connecticut has among the highest energy costs, among the highest electricity bills in the entire country, the second highest in the continental US at the last count, according to the EIA, right behind California, almost 3 times the cost of some of the lowest cost states. I'm talking to a gentleman before from Nebraska. If only we could pay 12-cent electricity. And some of that, I think, is just the natural geographical limitations of where we are in demand. But at the same time, part of it is policy choices that are made. So some of it's discretionary, and some of it's kind of natural. And what's the downstream cost of that? You know, obviously it comes out of our pocket, it takes away demand, but there's parts of the economy that are heavily reliant on energy inputs, and especially the manufacturing sector. Connecticut had one of the great high-tech, high-value-add manufacturing sectors in the country, but it's been stagnating for a long time. There's been no growth over 10 years of manufacturing jobs in Connecticut, while there's been an 8% increase nationwide. So where do we get our energy from? A lot of you will know this, but predominantly we get electricity from natural gas generation in New England, and the New England grid's kind of it bears its own distinction, not only physically and geographically, but also regulatorily with a single ISO New England regulator, which is kind of its own standalone quasi-governmental body, you know, between the federal and state governments. So New England should be considered a grid to itself, not just Connecticut, but we get the plurality of our power from natural gas, followed by nuclear, followed by imports, which are predominantly, the imports are, I think, predominantly hydro, actually, and some natural gas too, but predominantly hydro from Canada. Renewables with probably wind and then solar in that order, biomass, trash to energy, and then hydro, and a much smaller amount coal and oil. But you can see the transition that has happened in 20 years, where we were much more reliant on coal and oil plants, and with the natural gas boom in Connecticut predominantly, mixed with some kind of policy decisions on the federal level, we've migrated to a much higher reliance on natural gas than coal or oil, which has less than half the emissions of coal or oil, to say, and the greenhouse gas emissions, but also obviously the particulate kind of air pollution as well. So we've become much more reliant on natural gas compared to coal and oil over just 15 years. And because of that, you can see the trends in our emissions. So the circled area of the graph, and this is, again, ISO New England data, we've seen emissions go down 56% in 15 years just due to going from coal and oil to gas. Or almost entirely from going from coal and oil to gas. The forecast, as we see probably more wind, especially being added to the grid, a little bit more solar, calls for us to reduce emissions even more over the next 20 years. But even the projections, the kind of rosy projections over the next 20 years, is a much lower decrease, a much lower drop in emissions than we've seen over the last 15 years, just from going from coal and oil to gas, which is very interesting, very surprising, and I think positive. So that's where we are. High cost, those are the sources that we're reliant on. And we've seen actually a positive development in our environmental footprint too over the last 15, 20 years. So some positives, some negatives. So where are we going now? Well, this is ISO New England's expectations for 2035, 2040, 2050. Currently, peak demand runs around 25 gigawatts. And we probably saw that, for instance, last Christmas when it was very, very cold for that 1 week. We see it a couple times in the summer. But over the next 10, 20, 25 years, demand is expected to increase by historic proportions. So going from current 25 gigawatts of peak demand to 35 in 2035, 43 in 2040, and 57 in 2050. This excludes some recent policy developments in 4 New England states that will require, will ban the purchase, the sale of new gasoline-powered cars starting in 2035. So you'll see even more demand come on to the grid above, I think, those projections, and we can get into what my calculations are on that. But 25 gigawatts of peak demand to 43 in 2040 is a 70% increase in demand. So we're going to need to find a generation for that and deal with all kind of the downstream economic problems that are created by it, the needs for infrastructure investment and so on. This is a major historic change in our energy portfolio that we're anticipating, and it's not clear that we're ready to meet it. One of the other interesting things is that traditionally New England was a energy grid that saw its highest demand in the summer when it's hot. But it's expected that we're going to become a winter peaking region as more heat is electrified. We get more electric heat compared to gas and oil heat in New England. So whereas currently we're probably summer and peak winter roughly equal, we're expected that we'll be winter peaking. The problem with that is the natural gas supply, which is on a pipeline from the west, from Pennsylvania and so on, especially from the Marcellus Shale region, that provides natural gas not only for electricity generation, but also for home heating. And when supply capacity on that pipeline reaches its maximum in the winter, the precedents is for the heating, the home heating. So that means that there is a kind of an upward limit on how much natural gas we can use in the winter for electric generation at the current kind of levels of capacity. And that's another problem we're going to run into as well, and we can discuss. These are the drivers of demand. It's basically electrification of heat pumps in homes and buildings, and electric vehicles. It's actually, the projections are for more of the increase in demand to come from electric heat than from electric vehicles. But I think it is important to note that I think the EV number, the projected EV number, is low in ISO New England's latest study from about a year ago. 1.1 million vehicles is not that much not that many for 2040 in a region with about 25 million people, especially when, since that study was done, 4 of the states have said that they're going to ban the sale of new gasoline-powered cars starting in 2035. So my projection is that if you include Connecticut in that, and Connecticut is about a quarter of the New England population, and we're currently in the state government debating, as you've read in the news, whether or not to do the same mandate. I think back of the envelope, if you just said that half of all new vehicle purchases starting in 2035 due to these new policies become electric versus internal combustion engine, that you could add 3 gigawatts of demand per year. So that's like 4 new large offshore wind farms or 4 large natural gas plants per year of new demand. You're going to have to find the supply for it. It's not necessarily going to be easy. So where are the watts? We need to double our electricity generation in 20 years or so in order to meet the new demand. Currently, all of the new generation is expected to come from wind, battery, and battery is obviously not generating, it's storing and arbitraging, and solar. But about half of it, or if you exclude batteries, most of it, 75% of it, is expected to come from wind, and specifically offshore wind. And so these northeastern states have taken a very aggressive policy stance of directly contracting with offshore wind developers to develop many gigawatts of new offshore wind capacity, only a couple of which are starting to be built, but more of which have been contracted. So this is a graphic again from ISO New England showing where generation has been coming from and where it's expected to be coming from. The big graph, I think, is the most important. It's really wind. And battery storage is an arbitrage. It's storage. It's not generation. And then obviously some solar as well. But Massachusetts is doing the bulk of the work. Maine and Connecticut are doing a lot of the work too. But Massachusetts is going to be very aggressive. And then again, it's nearby, so it does affect supply and demand. New York and New Jersey are being fairly aggressive as well. New York, arguably, maybe even more aggressive on these procurements than Massachusetts. But where are we now? In the news this year, there's been a lot of negative developments about these offshore wind developments. New Jersey is seeing, people pulling back the development. Write-downs. There was a $1 billion kind of taxpayer bailout for the wind development in New Jersey. I don't know that would be met as kindly in other legislatures. Multi-billion-dollar write-downs for the developers. In New York, there's been the renegotiation of many of these contracts at higher rates, and in Connecticut, we're about to experience that. So one of the 2 large offshore wind contracts, this one by Avangrid, and it was at a relatively low price, they canceled the contract. And so they're going to rebid, presumably at a much, much higher rate. So these are my estimates of where costs are in reality. You see a lot of different numbers. You'll see investment banks put out numbers that I think aren't really reflective of where things really are. So it's tough. You talk to any given person, they'll give you different estimates. But from talking to so many people in the industry, from public hearings, from different documentation, this is roughly where I think the prices are in the industry now. I mean, some of it is legacy stuff, so some of it is effectively OpEx, and then some of it's new development, like the wind, so it's going to have CapEx too. But the wholesale market, which is mostly natural gas, basically is trading at $30 to $50 per megawatt hour. Forget what the exact numbers are. Just think of orders of magnitude. Existing nuclear, the Millstone power plant was contracted at a level cost of $50 per megawatt hour, so towards the top end of the wholesale market. Hydropower, is a discrete part of things, but 30 to 70, I think, with some of the subsidies, you'd say is probably maybe towards the higher end of that. Hydro-Quebec, so we're trying to build this new transmission line to bring in more hydropower from Quebec. Massachusetts is really kind of taking the lead on that. It looks like that could be $50, $60 per megawatt hour. You're mostly paying for transmission, so that's not a bad deal because it's clean, it's pretty reliable, but it also doesn't solve our winter reliability problems because when it's really cold, Canada claws back some of the energy in the coldest months, but otherwise it's actually a pretty good deal. But the offshore wind, we did our first contract at $100 per megawatt hour, so it's already 2.5 times what the wholesale market is. But according to the latest NYSERDA study out of New York, they have 4 offshore wind contracts, and a lot of them have been renegotiated. The average price of where they're going off now, where they're doing those contracts now, is $160 per megawatt hour, so about 4 times where the wholesale market is. And when Avangrid bids back in to Connecticut's RFP, I expect them to be about 14 cents, $140 if we're doing megawatt hours. Solar, it's more discrete, the development, and the cost of community solar, large-scale solar is going to be cheaper, and that's better. But with all the subsidies, it's my understanding from public hearings, I was directly asking at public hearings the solar developers, what's their all-in cost that they get back, and he said 17 cents. So my estimate, based on existing policies and subsidies for solar, it seems like the cost to the ratepayer, the cost back to the ratepayer that we're paying the developers is around 17 cents, 170 megawatt hours, but it's probably very different in different states. When we turn the lights on at any given hour of the day, when we use electricity, we expect it to work. So it's important that our sources of electricity are reliable too. It's one of the things we take for granted, and I hope we get to continue to take it for granted, but we shouldn't. Nuclear power runs over 90% of the time, the capacity factor. So basically the generation, the actual production divided by the nameplate, the total capacity. Nuclear is a very high capacity factor. Gas, coal, the fossil fuels, pretty high. Hydropower, a little less reliable. And then wind and solar, solar is the lowest. And a lot of these are geographically dependent, right? If you go to the middle of the country, Texas has a lot, for instance, has a lot of wind, and it's in the northern part of Texas because it's a Great Plains geography, lends itself to more efficient wind production. So you would see a higher capacity factor there. Offshore wind has a higher capacity factor. It's more reliable than onshore wind, but it also has a higher cost. So these are the trade-offs you're dealing with. We'll do the questions right at the end. And then solar, it's obviously a higher capacity factor in the southwest part of the country than it is in the northeast, down to 25%. So these are kind of the numbers that I look at when we think about reliability. So this is a really interesting data point, and when we were passing one of the bills that I authored to try to make our grid cleaner, more reliable, and more affordable, there's this expert who used to work at Vermont Yankee out of Vermont. She wrote a book, her name's Meredith Angwin, she wrote a book called Shorting the Electricity Grid, and she's very concerned about the future of the grid. In her book, there was this statistic that looked at two jurisdictions that have pretty aggressive clean energy goals, Ontario in Canada and Germany. And Germany is obviously known for very aggressive wind and solar procurements. So she compared what the actual greenhouse gas emissions were for Germany compared to Ontario being much more reliant on nuclear and hydropower. And the greenhouse gas emissions are 14 times higher in Germany than in Ontario. And why is that? It's because Ontario is reliant on higher capacity factor, more reliable forms of clean energy, mainly hydropower and nuclear. And given that part of that is a function of geography, having the St. Lawrence River there, but nonetheless, it's miles better than the emissions profile in Germany, which has been the large country that's been most aggressive in pursuing solar and wind. And they shut down famously or infamously many of their nuclear plants in recent years, now they find themselves, unfortunately, under the thumb of Putin. And I think that'll be one of the historically bad decisions in modern history as far as energy is concerned. Maybe not the worst decisions out of Germany in history. But certainly modern history, one of the worst energy decisions. Because when wind and solar don't work, you need something that's dispatchable, that works almost immediately. And really the answers to that are coal and oil. And coal and oil are the dirtiest sources. So Germany doesn't really have gas, and we obviously have the debate about the pipeline. So even though Germany has the highest proliferation of solar and wind, it has pretty high emissions because all that solar and wind actually needs to be backed up by coal or oil. So in New England too, it gets really cold. It gets hot in the summer, it gets cold in the winter, and over Christmas it got very cold in particular. And when that new demand comes online, we have to have supply that matches it almost immediately. Every 30 minutes, ISO New England is telling these backup peaking power plants whether they have to turn on or not. So the grid is always working, even though we're not seeing it. And when it got really, really cold last Christmas, a year ago, we went up to almost 40% of our generation coming from oil, which is actually quite stunning because you saw the kind of nameplate capacity at the beginning where we're really kind of gas, nuclear, more clean stuff and a little bit renewables too. So when it gets really cold and we need the energy, it's actually oil plants that we turn on in Connecticut, in New England, in order to match it. And most of those are kind of in Connecticut. A lot of them are operated actually out of from a firm in Stamford. So oil, when it gets really, really cold, as much as 40% of the grid is reliant on it in New England. The other options are not good ones. You got to keep the lights on, and that's a kind of preeminent concern of our energy policy. And we don't want rolling blackouts, but if the mismatch persists over the next 20 years, if we keep growing demand at 50%, 100%, and we don't have reliable generation to meet it, then the worst alternative could be that. And so it's not just a matter of high costs, which are the likely scenario, but it's also a matter of keeping the lights on, keeping the heat on, keeping the air conditioning on. And people who are more vulnerable are the ones who theoretically would suffer most from that. It is a matter of then safety and human life as well. The infrastructure costs are also something that are important. Those get expended by the utilities and recovered in our electricity bills. And so theoretically, from major infrastructure investments, from distributed generation, from more electrification, if you're looking for stocks to buy, maybe it's the utilities, because they make a certain rate of return of profit on those capital investments. So the utilities could be actually well situated nationwide. I'm not saying state to state, but nationwide to benefit from greater electrification and distributed generation, because it requires more wires, more distribution assets per kilowatt generated. Eversource anticipates that if from electrification in Connecticut of the vehicle fleet, that we'd probably need about $2 billion of investment just for the substations that are needed to handle the higher capacity. That's about $1,400 per household in Connecticut if you just draw it up. But it is a capital investment. It's not necessarily a recurring cost, although obviously the maintenance would be. So what can we do to change direction, to create a better way? I really do believe that as difficult as this problem is, that as much as it's about trade-offs and imperfect options rather than perfect solutions, that there is a positive way forward if we make some pivots. I introduced legislation last year to move us towards an all-of-the-above clean energy policy that creates more equal treatment for not just solar, wind, but also nuclear and hydro. Under our previous statutes, there was a great advantage in the regulatory and subsidy schemes for wind and solar compared to hydro and nuclear, even though they're clean in terms of the air pollution and they're clean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So ultimately what we were able to do in SB 7, which is bipartisan legislation that I co-authored with the Democratic chairman of that committee, was to meet halfway and include any new nuclear generation and more forms of hydropower in the state's renewable portfolio standard, which is kind of the main generic way that we subsidize clean sources of energy. It currently excludes, it up until now excluded all forms of nuclear and most hydropower, which I don't think made sense. So Connecticut is now just the second state in the country out of the 36 states that have renewable portfolio standards to include nuclear sources of any form in it after Indiana. I recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Post and have talked to some different think tanks around the country. I want to see all 36 of those states include nuclear and more hydropower. If we're to keep the lights on, if we're to have an affordable grid, if we're to protect the environment, states should be treating all forms of clean energy on roughly an equal basis rather than picking winners and losers, right? Rather than centrally designing our electricity grid. There needs to be some market forces, competition, and may the best source win, and may all sources compete on a level playing field. So an all of the above kind of clean energy standard, I think, is a good first step that all states should do. It's turnkey, it could be done. We only did it halfway in Connecticut. I want to go all the way, but this was a good start and very innovative, and I think puts Connecticut on the map. There are other ideas, I think, that need to be part of the solution. We have a lot of different procurement authorities, so instead of energy generation bidding into the wholesale market, there could actually be kind of a direct contracting, procurements by the state government at a fixed rate for a long period of time. You know, I think there needs to be a limitation on how we do that. We shouldn't be giving a fixed rate of purchase on the back of ratepayers that's 2 or 3 times higher than what the market rate for electricity is. I think we should limit that at something like, I think this is pretty modest to say 100% higher than what the wholesale market is. So there should be limitations when the government is picking winners and losers, and it shouldn't do that much. It should be a limitation at least on price. I think, again, that's a modest solution. So the natural gas pipeline that we talked about before from the west, which is limited in capacity, there are people, the investors in the pipeline, the owners of the pipeline are exploring the possibility of expansion. I think that the choice is here whether we continue to burn oil and gasoline and coal as the backup forms of generation or through gas-powered cars, or we expand the natural gas pipeline and bring on generation that is less than half the greenhouse gas emissions as those. Those are, I think, the real choices. So we have to explore the expansion of the pipeline in order to keep electricity running, keep the heat running when we have peak demand in the winter. Canadian hydropower has to be part of the solution. We talked about that before. I think we need to find alternative ways to improve EV proliferation. I think it's a positive for our economy, but I think forcing it on all people through a kind of catch-all mandate is highly unwise. It's higher cost to consumers. It requires enormous investment in the infrastructure that we haven't done, and it's going to require so much new generation that I don't think we're ready for. And finally, I think we could cut your electricity bill tomorrow by about 10%. If we just move the 10 to 12% of the electricity bill, that's just fees and programs that the state government created, back into the normal budget process. You'll see that in your electricity bill starting last month. It says 4 different categories of your costs, not just supply and distribution and transmission, but also quote-unquote public benefits. Those are the costs of actually of financing a bunch of different government programs, like 15 different government programs. That sounds like taxation to me, right? But the problem is it becomes an entitlement. It doesn't have to be renewed. It's as of right that they get to tax you through your electricity bill, the state government. Those programs should be financed through the normal budgetary process where we trade off costs and benefits every 2 years through the appropriations process. It shouldn't be on your backs as consumers just as a default. That's a regressive tax on seniors, people on fixed incomes, working class people. And it's just not the right way of creating effective programs either, because you're not evaluating them through the normal governmental policymaking process. So I think if you do these things, if you take all these discrete steps, I do think that you can create a grid that's more affordable. 10% reduction in cost immediately and greater reductions in costs in the long run if you have the right generation. You can create a cleaner grid with lower emissions per person if you go down this path of an all-of-the-above clean energy strategy. Most importantly, you can be sure that we'll be able to keep the lights on in 20 years. As we're adding more demand, we will have the reliable sources of generation and the infrastructure there to support it. So we are in an enormously precarious position as a region, as a state, in one of the building blocks of our entire economy and way of life, the electricity grid, which isn't given enough attention. But we can solve those problems, I think, with the right policy. And we can create a brighter future for our economy, our environment, and the quality of life here in Connecticut. So let's take nothing for granted. Let's try to collaborate and act. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions?
Hi, I have just a couple of questions. In your numbers for solar and wind, you had $100 to $170 per kilowatt hour. Does that include backup power?
In what sense?
Well, wind and solar are intermittent. So
Yeah.
They need backup power. So does that include?
No.
So actually, they're much more expensive. Does that also include disposal of the wind turbines?
It depends on what the procurement contracts would say. I assume that those cost considerations would be built into the procurement contracts. But the backup generation, you're exactly right. That's kind of like a tax on the electricity grid that someone else is going to have to pay to turn on the electricity when the intermittent sources aren't running. And there are separate RFPs out there for storage, for battery power, and we'll see where those costs come in. But you're right. The developers of the intermittent sources are not responsible for filling in the intermittency. So they can bid into the market at a low cost when the sources are running, but when they're not, you're posed with a difficulty.
So I really applaud your solution, to include nuclear. But who in their right mind would want to use solar and wind as energy sources? Because they're more expensive, they're intermittent, they're very expensive to dispose of, and then you've got nuclear, which is clean, safe, safest form of energy that's ever been developed. I guess my question is, you don't want to pick sides working for the government, but why not all nuclear?
Well, I think we should create a playing field that different sources compete on and see what happens. I think that we should create parameters for a market that promotes, again, reliability, affordability, and environmental considerations, and see what happens with technological development. There are good qualities to wind and solar. They're clean on the margins because they don't have operational costs really. Not dissimilar from nuclear, which doesn't have major fuel costs compared to, say, natural gas. The OPEX is pretty low. So those are some of the benefits, but the intermittency is a big problem. And overall, the present value calculations of the costs, I mean, you just go from where the bids are in the market right now, it's pretty high. So I do want to make it clear that I want to create a system that's agnostic to sources, but is biased towards certain goals: clean environment, affordability, and reliability, and let 1,000 flowers bloom.
If you reduce electricity costs 10 to 12%, what will that do to demand? Secondly, characterizing nuclear power as clean is misleading because it produces no greenhouse gases. But ask anybody who used to live near Fukushima whether it has any environmental impact.
Yeah. And those safety concerns have to be part of any regulation. And in the United States, there has never been a death from nuclear power. There's never been a death from spent nuclear fuel. So there are responsibilities and regulations that need to be part of the solution. But I think what people on both sides, on all sides of the political divide, understand is that as an alternative, you have to regulate for these considerations. You're absolutely right. But taken on the whole, you compare it to coal with the pollutants from the air. You compare it to even installation of rooftop solar. People die installing rooftop solar. The aggregate, cost to human life of nuclear compared to those sources is much, much lower. If you want to follow up, go ahead. Is localized. The spent fuel? Oh, yeah. There's never been a death. There's never been a death from spent nuclear fuel. There's never been a death from spent nuclear fuel. And all of it, if you took all the spent nuclear fuel in the United States over 70 years, you could pile it up 20 feet and fit it on a single football field. So the way they put it in canisters, they submerge it in water, and they keep it on the sites, and they have very tightly regulated for safety. I'm not saying that we don't need to we need to regulate these things. We need to protect people, and so. The amount of people who die from the pollutants from coal emissions and coal mining is far greater. So I guess part of my presentation, my goal is that there are no perfect solutions. There's trade-offs and costs of all these things, and I don't want to discount anything you're saying. I just think if you add up some of those considerations on safety, I have greater concerns about different sources from that standpoint than nuclear. But I hear what you're saying. There's no perfect solutions here. All of these are hard choices and need to be regulated tightly.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was absolutely fascinating. There's clearly a whole bunch of issues that are very hard to disentangle. But I'll just go to one specific issue, which is, has anybody in the generation business come to you and told you what a fully loaded cost of a megawatt hour of new nuclear would be? Because you're talking about $50 per megawatt hour for existing nuclear plants. There are all sorts of new technologies, and I understand this gentleman's concern, but this technology is evolving very quickly, and there's a lot going on in the space of nuclear generation that's lowering the cost and and increasing the safety standards. Once you take that into consideration, when people come up and say, okay, this is what we believe the cost of new nuclear generation with all its loaded back-end costs of disposal, fuel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, many thoughts on that, and that could be its own presentation. Those are really good points. The $50, the $40 for nuclear, that's really existing nuclear. So it's in the range of the wholesale market, but towards the higher end. I think when I say there are trade-offs and it's difficult to find answers to these problems, I think the most obvious answer is that existing operational kind of functional nuclear plants in the United States and the Western world, like Germany, they cannot be retired unless there's a real problem. That's the biggest problem. Those are low cost because they're low OPEX. The problem is the CapEx, if you were to build new nuclear plants under the existing regulations, are astronomical. They saw that in Georgia, which just recently put online a new nuclear plant. And most of that is because of the federal regulations, which are so Byzantine that some of them actually openly contradict one another. And so when the NRC was created in the late 70s, there's been like 4 new nuclear plants built since then, and there were dozens that were built before, and all of those that are built before, most of those that are built before are still operational and working. So as you say, the advancements in the technology, the advanced nuclear, the small modular reactors, or fission in maybe the more distant future, but the small modular reactors, I think people in the industry seem to genuinely believe that in 10, 15 years, those are going to be commercialized, those are going to be operational, and they're going to be, much lower cost. So we want to create a fertile ground for that innovation as long as everything else is there. And that was why my policy change, that the compromise was focused on new nuclear, because we want to create a fertile ground for that innovation and development of clean energy when the technology is there, when the cost considerations are there. With the federal regulations right now, building new kind of traditional nuclear plants is just not economical. But if the technology is there with the small modular reactors, you could put where reactor 1 is, the Millstone's in eastern Connecticut. The only place legally where you could put any nuclear energy in Connecticut is on the Millstone site. And so there's a retired reactor there, reactor 1, and theoretically if the small modular reactor technology was cost effective and developed, then they could put an SMR where reactor 1 is right now and see a 50%, 30% increase in their generation of clean electricity. So that's probably where the future is. I mean, that seems like the consensus in the industry, and we want to create the right policy grounds for that sort of innovation. I don't want to say, we're going to give you whatever cost. They have to compete. But we want to create a fertile ground for innovation of clean electricity, including SMRs.
Ryan?
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for addressing this issue. I have talked to numerous former and current state legislators about how we are going to meet the demand for electrification of heating and also of the electric cars that were being projected. So thank you so much. Secondly, one subject you didn't talk about, and I was surprised at the cost of wind and solar, but one of the things you didn't talk about is this push that's been happening for putting solar cells on residential properties. And I visualize a future where every residential property and industrial property that has sun will have solar cells. And I'm wondering, where you see that and where you see that going.
Yeah, I think it would be great. I think it would be great if, depending on where the market mechanisms are and where the cost is. Again, what seems to be the case is that when you kind of community solar, the utility scale solar, so you put a ton of solar in a field somewhere, facing south without encroachments on sunlight, that at cost, that's actually much more affordable for the grid, for consumers. When you put it residential, it doesn't seem like the cost scales, and then you have some reliability concerns. But if it works, again, I don't want to pick a winner or loser. If the technology is there, the cost is there, and it can compete with the other sources, it should definitely be part of the solution. And we want those industries to compete, to innovate, and to solve problems. So, I think, theoretically it's great. Just the same way that EVs and plug-in electric hybrids, are great as a arbitrage mechanism, a storage mechanism. And battery storage is, I think, something that could be a great part of the solution. It's just a matter of whether the economics are there. And, I want those industries to compete and solve problems. It seems like currently, in terms of the cost, that utility scale community solar, the large scale solar, is much more cost effective than the residential solar, generally speaking. But I want to see them compete and solve problems and get to a low price point, and whatever flowers bloom, let them bloom. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Christine Edwards, and here's an energy source that hasn't been talked about here, and I don't know how many people know of this. Anyone familiar with Bloom boxes? They're electrochemical. They're the cleanest that we could get. And companies like Apple, Google, Walmart, even Coca-Cola are using them. And Apple and such, it's providing a third of their energy. And this is something which doesn't have any problem in terms of emissions. It's clean, it's electrochemical. It would allow the individual to have a bloom box about the size of a compressor, which would take care of their entire house, and is coming more and more into certain grids, and particularly in commercial use. Even Coca-Cola is using it. And I think it's something that we really have to look at much more, put more energy, because we certainly are not going to have a plug to go to Mars. We have electrochemical power that allows this solid oxide that has basically two metals, and the flow between them produces the electrons. So this is the cleanest we could get, but we need to have more use of it. It would be great to see the town hall have one bloom box for at least a third of its energy production, and to see the fact that we could have this for the schools as another solution, and not just looking at other things that have been pretty much out there, and they're old. And nuclear, it's great, it's clean, except when you have to do cleanup, no matter what. Thank you. I don't know what all the cost is, but that's going to be coming down as more and more people engage in it. Of course, but you need to have the research, you need to have, and listen, Coca-Cola wouldn't be putting anything into it if it wasn't cost effective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for exploring a wide range of issues around reliability and supply of power. I could ask about 4 or 5 questions. I'll try to restrict myself. First of all, I worked at the NRC briefly in the early 80s, and there was talk then of a standardized plan for a nuclear plant where the plant itself, if it met the specifications, would be approved, and the only issues would be around siting. As far as I know, that's gone nowhere, even though it's talked about. Second, what you've said about nobody killed in a power plant, whereas coal mines, how many died in coal mines, was well known, certainly within the staff of the NRC, and a point of pride. But what are we going to do about nuclear waste? How can we guarantee that the storage pools for spent fuel rods will still be maintained 20, 40, whatever years from now, during the lives of our children and grandchildren and beyond? It requires actual costs, even when the plant's been decommissioned, and is simply a burden to the power company to keep it secure from all sorts of things.
And that's that is exactly what the responsibilities are. Part of the responsibilities of the regulators and the NRC in particular needs to be, and it's a very important one. And up until now, and this is not a new technology, it's 60, 70 years old, we've been able to handle that, and I have confidence that in the future that we'll continue to. It's not a lot of space. Again, all of it ever produced fits in a Walmart. So, you know, but it's being kept on the sites, and the plants pay into a fund in order to help ensure that it'll be secured from an economic standpoint. So safety is always a priority, and your considerations are exactly right, and you know the answers to it better than I do. It's very interesting that you're the NRC and you've kind of had those experiences. It would be a great issue, I think, for a federal, because it's more of a federal regulatory issue than a state regulatory issue. All these considerations, the NRC stuff, it'd be a really great spot for a kind of a federal policymaker, a congressman or a senator to take charge on, because the implications nationwide are very important, and so much of it is held up. I'd also like to see the comparisons on costs between other countries doing, traditional nuclear and the United States doing it. But listen, safety, to the gentleman's point, safety always needs to be a top consideration. And if we're doing something wrong on safety and regulation, then we need to correct it. And, that'll flow through to other economic models on different sources. Because it's mostly a federal issue, I don't have the exact answer, but it seems like the way things are done from that standpoint have been effective thus far. I guess that's my general answer.
Hi, my name's Jackie Cake. I'm from Stanford. Two questions. First, I'm hearing a groundswell of complaints about the government benefits line item on our bills. What can be done quickly about that? The second question is there support in your committee and across the CGA for a revitalization or reamendment or something, SB 7?
And what particular parts of SB 7?
What happened to SB 7? Did it get it didn't?
It passed. It was
did
signed
pass,
into law,
okay.
yeah.
Is it sufficient for what we need?
No, but I think it was a step in the right direction. So first things first. So the public policy charges are what I was talking about. They're like 10 or 12% of your bill. They're a little bit more than that, but some of those I think are justifiable parts of your bill. I think most of that, which is most of the public policy charges that we're paying in our electricity bill, equating to about 10 or 12%, are actually discretionary fiscal tax and spending decisions. And those should be part of the normal appropriations process, the budget process, where we vet costs and benefits, where we put it into a budget, where you're paying for it in your taxes because it's a discretionary program. Again, these are 15 different government programs. They amount to about $300 million, and your electricity bill is probably $300, $250 higher because of it, because you're kind of being taxed for those programs. It should go through the normal budget process. That's how you could reduce your bills by 10% almost immediately. There should be transparency. Most of those programs are probably fine. Maybe they need to be tweaked. Some of them are not. So I agree with the premise of your question completely. SB 7, I think, was a good product. I submit a bill every year to do just that, and you can submit public testimony in February when I submit the bill again, and I'll put it in my newsletter, which you can subscribe to at senatorfazio.com. But that was part of my bill last year, and that was one that didn't pass because we couldn't get the bipartisan buy-in from my colleagues across the aisle. SB 7, I think, was a good product because we compromised and got as much of what I thought was right and as much of what my Democratic colleagues thought was right done as possible. I think it improves utility regulation. It really does put PURA in a better place to protect consumers and regulate utilities in a fair way. What PURA ultimately does with the powers that they're given is their choice and a matter of personnel and their decision making. But I think we created a better process that's more transparent and will have better results for consumers. So it was mostly a bill about utility regulation. But then my parts of the bill, the parts that I was the primary author of, were things like the changes to the renewable portfolio standard that I mentioned, the bill transparency, so the fact that you're now getting more line items in your electricity bill explaining what you're paying for, including the public policy charges, and so on. And then a couple of the utility regulation ideas were also mine. But I have to say, and I think a bright spot in all this, and we have a lot of problems that we've inherited, I think the Energy Committee, we work very well together in a very bipartisan manner, and we don't always agree. But Norm Needleman, the Senate chair, and Jonathan Steinberg, the House chair, have become friends, and they're really good guys, and they're practical thinkers. And even when we disagree, we do it agreeably, and we're trying to work towards the betterment of the entire state. Really one of the best parts of my job and best part of my experience over the last 2 years have been as ranking member of that committee, because it's serious business and the people on both sides of the aisle are serious, and even when we disagree, we do it agreeably, and we're trying to work towards kind of the betterment of the state. I'm just talking about some of my point of view in all of this. Pretty easy. I have a good relationship with the members of PURA. Again, don't always necessarily need to agree, but Marissa Gillette is a very smart person. She's a very hard worker. I know she ruffles a lot of feathers, but she's working towards the benefit of consumers, and she's very tough on the utilities, and she gets some flack for it. But the utilities are a regulated monopoly. They need to have a tough regulator, and so that's what she's getting flack for. I mean, I like Marissa. I think she's tough, and I think she's a hard worker, and I think she's sharp as a tack, and I'm glad she's on PURA.
Thank you. One of the concerns that I have about nuclear is that it's cooled by water,
Yeah.
which is then discharged into Long Island Sound. Currently, we're seeing the habitat changing because of the warmth of the sound going up. Is there any way to deal with that?
Yeah, and when I was at Millstone, we had a large presentation about that, and it's tightly regulated by the EPA. So they constantly are testing the marine life in the radius where the warmed water is being kind of recycled, and they and it basically the warming effect dissipates at like a few meter tens of meters out from where the plant is. So, it's one of the kind of necessary parts of generation. But, the overall sampling of marine life from the area, what is that, is that the Niantic River? I forget which river it is. Yes? Okay, good. My resident Eastern Connecticut nutmegger approves of my geography. The overall, they continuously sample the overall marine life population in the area, and what their surveys say, it hasn't been affected. It's been constant. The lobster populations declined in the area, but that's because of more broad environmental changes. But the other wildlife has not been affected. So it's something that, again, needs to be tightly regulated, and that's exactly what the federal government should be there for, and the EPA is responsible for that, and they need to continue to do that, and we need to continue to monitor that. But they do it presently, and their surveys have shown that the marine life has been healthy and thriving in the area, and the heating effect of a few degrees dissipates 10-20 meters out from where the plant is. Yes.
Yes. Hi, Senator Farragut. Thank you very much for your remarks. I appreciate it. As someone who's been in the power generation business my whole career, I see a lot of good things in your policy, and I applaud it. I do have a couple concerns. You talk about 75% of the roughly doubling growth, if I understood you correctly, over the next 20 to 25 years will come from wind.
Yeah.
And wind, as you properly pointed out, is intermittent, and so it needs backup. And if we're adding that much wind, where will the backup come from? And I know the typical answer is storage, but if you look at where storage is in technology development space, it has a long way to go before grid-scale storage will be in a position to really provide the needed backup. So you have to build other things. So that's one concern, maybe you can comment. But my second question is more a pocketbook issue. You talk about the fact that the growth is largely driven by home heating, if I understood you correctly, and a move from natural gas and other sources to electricity. And yet, when I look at the logic of it, we have the third highest electricity rates in the country. There wasn't anything on your list of cost per megawatt hour or kilowatt hour or whatever that made me think costs are going down. In fact, clearly, if anything, they're going up and going up significantly. So this seemingly relentless drive to get rid of fossil fuels when natural gas has been a main contributor to a very substantial reduction in carbon and CO2 emissions in the state. How do we get more consumer pocketbook issues into that kind of policy decision? Because, as you point out, a lot of the people are on fixed incomes in this room, and substantially rising electricity rates, which is what I see in that policy, are not going to be well received by most of us and a lot of others. So how do we change that policy of the relentless drive? We can make great environmental improvements continuing for a while with natural gas. How do we get that kind of policy adjusted for pocketbook issues? Sorry for such a long question.
I think everything kind of comports with the numbers we presented, and a lot of it's just, it's just descriptive. I'm just taking the information from ISO New England, and, it's anticipated that they're going to rely on battery and wind to supply it. And, we know this has been contracted at 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Compared to like 4 or 5 cents in the market. So it's going to have a significant, if all this goes forward in 10 years, you're going to see your electricity bills go up by, $500,000. I mean, that's the path we're on. So if you like your electricity bills now, you can just wait. If you don't like them now, just wait. So that's kind of the direction we're going in. I think I operate from a principle of like Pareto efficiency. Like I want to do things that make certain things better without making other things worse. So the steps I want to take on the environment are to make the environment better without like really hurting people's quality of life and economic situation. And I want to make our economic situation better and our cost of living better without hurting the environment. So I think those are the pragmatic places from which I operate. And I think the consequence is a platform like I presented with 6 different major ideas, 7 different major ideas that, not any one of them is going to solve the problems, but I think they all fit those parameters, and I think those are the parameters most people want to see. Protect the environment, but don't, bankrupt me or turn the lights off, and reduce costs, but don't do it at the expense of the environment. And so I think if you take all those solutions together, those 6 or 7 things together, it fulfills those considerations, and it also, is going to move our economy in the right direction. I don't think there are any perfect solutions here, but I do think there are options to move us in the right direction, and that doesn't even consider what technological innovation might be. I mean, hopefully someone figures out technological solutions to this, whether it's on solving batteries, making batteries really, really, really affordable, or it's making nuclear really affordable and deployable for a new generation. I hope someone solves this problem for us. That's the one thing, I do have faith in the American citizen to innovate their way out of problems. History is replete with those examples. So let's hope that those policy solutions aren't actually necessary. But I do think they are, from my vantage point right now, and I think that's reflected in your question.
Excellent presentation, and go nuclear, and there's a thing called Yucca Mountain, which could solve all the problems if the politicians got out of the way. But one thing you did not mention is increased LNG importing into New England, and there was a very nice project 10 or 15 years ago to have LNG carriers come in the Long Island Sound, regasify, and stick a lot of LNG into our systems. Nice, clean natural gas, and there is natural gas still going into Boston, LNG, I think. So that was not on your list, and I was not sure if you were aware of that.
Yeah, the Everett terminal off the coast of Massachusetts is a regasification plant. That LNG is really necessary probably to meet the winter demand, as we talked about when we get to 25 gigawatts in the winter and it's 0 degrees out, and we have, it's between oil or gas, and, we probably prefer gas. The problem is that the Everett terminal's losing money, and I think it's anticipated that there's going to need to be, the governments in the Northeast are probably Massachusetts, so that's the good news, is probably going to be out of pocket for like $50 million a year in funding their OPEX, their losses on the Everett terminal. So the Everett terminal, I think what people, it seems like ISO New England and the smart people in the room, when they make their calculations on supply and demand, they think that the regasification plant, the existing one, Everett, has to stay online, even though the Mystic natural gas plant that's abutting it is going offline, so it's going to hurt its economic situation. But it's going to cost, ratepayers and taxpayers, but it'll probably be Massachusetts taxpayers. And that's kind of the negotiation that's happening with the Commissioner of Environment in Connecticut and the Commissioner of Environment in the other states. There is a bit of a prisoner's dilemma in some of these decision-making processes, because we all bear the regional costs and benefits of all these decisions. But when someone makes a procurement for more supply, it's Connecticut or Massachusetts ratepayers paying for it, but the rest of the market's going to benefit from more supply going into the market and driving down the price, even if it's at a higher cost, because only one state's ratepayers are paying for it. So, one thing that I think, maybe the Lamont administration and Katie Dykes are getting right is that there needs to be more regional coordination in these things, and sometimes we've borne the brunt of us taking the burden of specific decisions, and other times, Massachusetts has, for instance. It seems like Everett Terminal will more likely than not be kept online as regasification capacity, and it probably will be on the backs of Massachusetts residents, and it'll probably cost an aggregate of like $50 million a year in OPEX.
Senator Fazio, thank you very much.